Now, you've probably heard numerous articles claiming the church is in decline. Our society in the West is increasingly biblical illiterate. There's no room for God in our Western culture anymore. Believing in a divine being is archaic. It doesn't align with the progressive society. Well, that's what the advancement of science and technology has proven, right? But is that the full picture? What if belief in God is gaining interest and respect once again? Well, that's what we're exploring in this week's Life Issues. My guest is a writer, speaker, a broadcaster who's known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians, most notably through his globally recognised radio show and podcast, Unbelievable. It's a great pleasure to welcome to Life Issues, Justin Brierley.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, I have to say, and I have already told you this off mic, but I'm a huge fan. I first came across your Unbelievable podcast, which I know you left about a year or so ago. But my journey with that started about 9 years ago in 2015. I was working on a farm in Australia, manual labour, getting up at 4:30 in the morning, and I was hungry for conversations, for discussions that were going to feed me, that I was going to learn from. And I came across Unbelievable and I was hooked. I really enjoyed listening to the many fascinating discussions you had exploring faith, science, theology, culture, so many conversations that I wasn't hearing anywhere else. And it really helped me think and make sense of my faith and the questions I had, the doubt I was kind of grappling with, and my life. And I know that your subsequent podcasts, Ask NT Write Anything, The Big Conversation, have all been part of that as well. But you've recently launched the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God podcast documentary series and book with the same title. I really want to start just hearing a bit of the journey you've been on and how the conversation has changed since you started out hosting discussions between believers and non-believers. 15, 20 years ago. And I wonder if you could just tell us how it's changed and whether back then it felt like you were on the back foot ever, like having to try and prove God's existence.
Yeah, well, it's so lovely to hear the way you bumped into the Unbelievable show. And I've heard many similar stories of people listening in many far-flung parts of the world. So it's always wonderful to encounter people who've come across that show. It was a show that began in the early mid-2000s and really, started in the heyday of what has come to be known as the new atheism. So this was a very sort of strong, dogmatic, anti-religious view that was championed by certain people like the biologist Richard Dawkins and the journalist Christopher Hitchens, other public intellectuals like Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett. They became known as the so-called four horsemen of new atheism, very much banging the drum for science and reason, but also very critical, dismissive, often sort of actually just making fun of and ridiculing religion and its place in the world. So this was the sort of atmosphere in which the Unbelievable show was born. And I was trying to bring Christians and non-Christians together for dialogue and debate. And in that sense, the shows and the debates reflected a lot of that, the tenor of what was going on in the culture then. These big bombastic figures, saying religion's terrible for you, we need to do away with it. I did, get one or two of those sort of those architects of new atheism on the show, but many people who represented that viewpoint. And we had some, really fascinating debates over the years, doing all kinds of issues, history, ethics, science, faith, philosophy. Essentially, in that time, I discovered really good reasons, actually, why Christian faith makes sense, that actually Christianity can stand on its own 2 feet intellectually. And I discovered that a lot of the new atheist sort of thing was actually rhetorical, it was bombastic. And in fact, a lot of serious thinking atheists didn't actually put much credence in the new atheist arguments against God. So it was fun to be part of all of that. And I think it was important because I think the church was caught on the back foot. Apologetically speaking. Again, apologetics, for those who haven't heard that word, is simply a kind of word, comes from the Greek word apologia, meaning to make a defense of. And so apologetics, which is what I've been involved in pretty much all my life, is the intellectual defense of the Christian faith. And I think it was important for the church to sort of pick up its apologetics and theology books again, as well as, having that kind of more emotional, experiential side to Christian faith. I think we had to relearn the art of engaging some of these serious objections to faith. But having said all that, I did notice the tone of the conversation beginning to change over the years, and more people who are coming on perhaps as a non-Christian on a show were saying, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins kind of atheist. They were sort of distancing themselves from this new atheist movement. And I think that's partly because the movement itself started to run out of steam. The publishing phenomenon sort of fizzled out. It didn't ultimately, I think, answer the questions people really have deep down. Science and reason are good for some things, but they won't build you a meaningful life. They're not the tools for those why questions, if you like, that are always going to be there for people. And in the end, the movement itself kind of suffered all kinds of internal fractures and disagreements and fallings out, which I sort of document in the book and podcast, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, because that's an interesting story in itself. But it is sort of, but overall, as I say, what I noticed was that this new atheist sort of thing waning and a different conversation replacing it. And so really, that's really where the thrust of the new book is. How has the conversation changed in our culture? Why did new atheism sort of have this sudden, popularity and then wane so quickly? And what can we learn from the new people, not necessarily Christians, but people who are nevertheless saying far more sympathetic things about the value of faith? And those are the sorts of conversations I've really been interested in hosting and teasing out over the last few years now.
And I'm looking forward to exploring more about that journey and what you've learned and how it's changed in terms of the dialogue. But I want to pick up on just that term, new atheism. You mentioned that it was really a strong movement in the mid-noughties. How would you define it differently to atheism as just a general term? What made new atheism so unique at that time?
Yes, I'd say there was nothing particularly new about the arguments of new atheism. Atheism has been around, a long time. It's essentially a denial of the existence of God, either, and often the kinds of arguments put for that are things like the problem of suffering and evil. And so there's been a kind of a lively back and forth, between Christian theism and atheism for centuries, really. What was new about what happened in the mid 2000s was that it just took on a very public persona. It was there in the op-eds and editorials of newspapers. There were TV shows being created. Richard Dawkins hosted a couple of sort of Channel 4 TV documentaries. It was this publishing phenomenon, the God Delusion, God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. These were best-selling books at the time. And there was just a sense, I think, that, I get the sense that a few different things came together to kind of create this environment. You had 9/11, which I think for a lot of people had been a catalyst for thinking, well, maybe religion's really not good for us. I think the problem is that a lot of people just lumped all religion together, when in fact, obviously, 9/11 was a result of a very specific brand of fundamentalist Islam. But nevertheless, it gave this sense that religion's kind of bad for us. It makes people do crazy things. You had sort of some controversies going on, especially in the US, around the teaching of intelligent design or creationism in the classroom. You had some of those sort of cultural issues floating around. And of course, you had the coming of age of the internet, which allowed many people who may never have had an opportunity to band together to suddenly find each other. And so it meant that a lot of skeptics, people who were disillusioned or upset with what they perceived to be, religion kind of having too much power or control, getting together and forming these sort of atheist communities. And I think that was kind of where a lot of the energy from it came from. It was very much an online phenomenon. And in that sense, it reflected the kind of the tone that you often get online in chat rooms and social media. It was very dismissive. It was a lot of memes and a lot of kind of derogatory comments and so on. And that came through with some of the comedians involved in it, Ricky Gervais, Bill Maher and others who took that opportunity where it was seen as very almost edgy or cool to kind of dismiss religion. And so you had comedy stand-up routines, So it was not so much the content, but it was more the character of the atheism that was new. It was very willing to sort of stand up and very boldly and aggressively even shout down religion. You had here in the UK, you might remember the sort of atheist bus campaign, and that was the closest thing to an advertising campaign for atheism. The red London buses bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." In America, the Reason Rally, which was a sort of tens of thousands of people descending on the mall in Washington, D.C. to champion science and reason. And so these were things that, it's funny looking back on it, if I'm honest. And a lot of people look back on it and think, gosh, that was a weird moment, wasn't it? When atheism seemed to have this real surge in interest and popularity. But it was, I think, as I say, a number of those different factors that came together to give it that energy and that lift. And that was the new atheism. As I say, it didn't actually last that long. I'd say there was a sort of 10 to 15 year period. And then I think a lot of people just started to question the whole premise of the movement itself. But it was an exciting time to be hosting these kinds of conversations and discussions.
It's interesting as you're sharing those memories. I do remember being at university in the early to mid noughties, moving into London to work in broadcasting, and yeah, it was definitely cool to be an atheist. It was, like you say, it was popular, it was loud, it was even just the terminology that was used, like Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It was like, there was this kind of, as if you'd ever believe there's a God. There's not like oh, let's talk about why I believe this and why you might believe that. It was quite a dismissive narrative. And I found myself, as someone who'd been brought up as a Christian, struggling really to then articulate what I might believe or grown up with believing, and because I didn't know how to kind of combat it, but I didn't want to combat, but come back, maybe that's a better phrase.
Yeah.
So I think, that's why it was so important with what you did with Unbelievable, particularly. And I know there's others who are also who are passionate about apologetics, like you've explained to us what that is, but really giving the reason, sharing giving the reason for the hope they have. And that's been such an important, I know, part of this journey of how it's changed. I just want to pick up on what it was like for you in those early days. Did it feel like an uphill battle? Did it feel like you were having to defend in like an emotional, like, listen to me, I've got something to say? Or were people listening? Were the new atheists listening to you, or were they just trying to get their points across?
Yeah, very often with some types of characters, you did feel like you were speaking to a brick wall, and that potentially no amount of evidence or reason or nuanced debate would ever persuade them away from their position. And I think it's fair to say, actually, that a lot of behind the kind of the intellectual reasons often given among the new atheists, there were actually emotional reasons why people rejected faith as well. And I think that's just normal. We're all a mixture of emotion and reason, aren't we? So it's interesting to me that, yeah, looking back, there were probably we've all been there, haven't we, on a Facebook page, and you can end up in an argument which might go on for hours and hours, and you get to the end of it and think, I'm not sure that made absolutely any difference, because there's a point at which if someone just doesn't want what's on offer, they're going to, come up with yet another argument or whatever against it. So I think I quickly learned that there's a limit to how much you can do with Christian apologetics. I think apologetics is really useful. But it's primarily useful, I think, for sort of removing roadblocks, if you like, to someone who wants to walk down that road towards Jesus at the other end. And it might be like they've got a question over, well, what about the problem of suffering? And if you can provide some intellectual reasons why there may be a way of understanding that differently, you can remove that roadblock. And maybe they're then asking, well, how do I know Jesus really existed? And you can present them with some historical evidence. Maybe you remove that roadblock. And that's great. I think that's where apologetics really comes into its own. But the person still has to want to walk down the road to what's on offer at the end. You can't force them with apologetics to do that. And for me, that's the key thing, is that you've got to understand where the reasoning kind of ends, and actually you come to a matter of the heart in the end. And so I often bumped into that, I think, along the way, that there was a point at which there was no point continuing to just endlessly debate someone who didn't want ultimately what you were offering. So those were some of the lessons learned along the way. I did feel in the end that, as I say, it was worth doing, not just because obviously there were people who changed their mind, skeptics who became Christians in the process of reasoning through these arguments and evidence, but also just for the fact it gave a lot of Christians a sense of confidence, actually, that this wasn't just a delusion, as you say. It was there's actually a long historical, credible witness to the intellectual strength of Christianity, and just people discovering that alongside their experience of Christianity. The problem is, when you're entering a discussion or debate with someone, it's good to have that personal testimony of the way Jesus has changed your life. It's essential, in fact. But there's always going to be a point at which that person says, well, that isn't necessarily my experience. So is there anything like we both have kind of evidence for that you can tell me about? And I've found it really useful in those conversations to point people to some of the scientific or philosophical or historical evidence for faith, and just to kind of say, well, actually, this has made sense for a lot of people. So I think it's a great thing to have in your tool belt. It's not the whole picture, though, by any means. But I was glad in that sense that the new atheists did force us to sort of get back into that mode and realize, actually, no, for some people this is important, and we do need to provide these kinds of intellectual reasons for faith.
And I know that you Your podcast, the new podcast, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, really worth checking out. It's because it's a documentary style, different to what you've done before. And I know you've got lots of different talking heads, interviews that you weave in out, and really sharing this story of how the conversation's changed. But I wonder, hosting so many debates where people are trying to disprove God for so many years, did you ever worry that your faith would weaken, or did that ever happen where you know, we're really grappling with your relationship with your faith and God?
Yeah, definitely. There were absolutely times when some of the issues and objections that I was only just starting to learn about myself, you know, I was very wet behind the ears when I entered the unbelievable thing. Absolutely, there were times when that gave me pause for thought. You know, the odd sleepless night when had maybe just read a highly skeptical book, making really cogent arguments against Christianity. Very often, though, it was one of those things where you would then sort of bring the right person on opposite that skeptic, and you'd realize, there's always two sides to every story. I mean, one good example of that I've written about before is a well-known skeptical New Testament scholar called Bart Ehrman, who has his own story of kind of losing faith and so on, and has written many books very critical of the kind of transmission of the New Testament documents. Is the Bible reliable, essentially? And one of his most famous ones was one called Misquoting Jesus. And I remember the first time I had him on the Unbelievable show, I just read his book, and it did make me think, gosh, can we trust any of this stuff? But then when I actually brought biblical theologian and scholar Peter J. Williams from Cambridge on, I realized it's a classic story of like, what is a glass half empty for Bart Ehrman can actually be a glass half full for a different perspective. And
Yeah.
it was actually in hosting the conversation that I realized actually a lot of the things that are painted as a negative can easily be just looked at in a slightly different light. And you see actually, oh, it turns out there's an awful lot of good reasons to trust the Christian story. So, and that's a case in point where I think when you actually look into the evidence for the reliability of the New Testament material, for instance, whatever the issues may be with it, it still stands head and shoulders above every other form of ancient biography and historical record we have. I mean, that is just a historical fact. And again, a lot of the issues that Bart was pointing out in his book turn out to be very minor, incidental things that can easily be sorted through the whole science of textual criticism. In fact, as Peter J. Williams eventually pointed out on the discussion we did, there's only a tiny handful of question marks that actually come out of Bart's book over the New Testament documents. And in each of those cases, Bart thinks he knows what the answer is to those. So it's like, once you kind of, sometimes it just takes digging into these things to get below some of the issues and realize, it turns out this wasn't quite the big issue I thought it was. I mean, there are other things though where sometimes, you know, I had to change my mind on a subject. You know, again, lots of different Christian perspectives exist on all kinds of issues like creation and evolution, doctrinal issues. I mean, one where I changed my mind was on the issue of hell, for instance, and I probably entered the unbelievable space kind of having kind of imbibed, I suppose, you know, a typical view of this so-called eternal conscious torment view of hell. And by the time I finished hosting Unbelievable, I changed my mind completely on that. And I had been persuaded through hosting a number of different dialogues and debates that actually what is sometimes technically called annihilationism or conditional immortality is a better way of understanding the eternal destiny of those who ultimately don't put their trust in Jesus. Now, that can sound like a bit of a sort of dry and academic sort of thing, but it is actually an important thing. It's the kind of issue where a lot of people have struggled with it. But I just think that actually there are certain aspects of Christian faith where it's fine for people to take different perspectives on it. They aren't necessarily core, if you like, where you have to believe a certain way to even think of yourself as a Christian. And this was one where I felt actually there was a better sort of biblical witness and philosophical rationale for saying that actually there isn't this unending conscious torment, that actually the final end for those who deny Christ is a sort of is extinction, effectively annihilation. So that's again, that's a controversial position for some people, but it's one I felt really happy to take actually in the end. And that was one example where I definitely sort of changed my mind because I started to weigh things differently because of the conversations I was having in that case between different kind of theological perspectives.
And that's what I love about this whole conversation with apologetics. Um, Listening to people who've got different worldviews, who've got questions that sometimes I wouldn't even think to ask. That's why I found your podcast so helpful. And actually, I remember going to an Unbelievable conference a few years back, and Glenn Scrivener doing a really good or giving a really good response to someone asking about hell and the kind of what the Bible says and what that really means in reality. And similarly, you explain it way better than I. But I remember being really challenged on that concept and having my heart and eyes open to a different way of thinking. But it was there in the text, in the book in the Bible that Glenn was sharing from. But I just think it's so helpful to have conversations where you're being challenged, where you're being almost stretched into thinking to some of these uncomfortable subjects. If you're a Christian, in the Bible, the awkward parts that you're like, I don't really want to go there. But also for those of us who haven't got faith or haven't really ever even started questions around kind of purpose and meaning, just hearing others have conversations can really start to spark questions within you. And I want to pick up on something you've mentioned around the tone of the debate. Something that really strikes me about apologetics, so the Christian intellectual reasoning, is that I find that often Christians treat their counterparts within debates not in a combative, trying to convert them, but in a more respectful, sharing hope in a lot of ways. And on the Life Issues podcast, we recently had Peter Linus, head of the Evangelical Alliance, on. And we were talking about worldviews and when we're sharing our different thoughts. And he said something that really stuck with me. He said he goes into debates knowing he probably won't change the mind of the person he's debating, but he's always thinking of the many others who are listening, who are asking questions, who don't know what they think or have maybe a strong worldview. But do you think that the way we answer questions, the way we debate, affects the outcome of the discussion?
Absolutely. And yeah, I think that it's right there, actually, in a scripture you sort of referenced earlier. 1 Peter 3:15 is sort of well known as the sort of the apologist's verse. Always be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you about the reason for your hope. So that's the kind of the apologetics bit, being prepared to give a reason and so on. But we sometimes forget the end of that verse, which is, but do this with gentleness and respect. And the whole point of that is that the way your words and arguments land will absolutely be dependent on the way you put it across. So I've sadly seen, sometimes very accomplished Christian apologists and thinkers sort of maybe demolish their opponent in an argument, but they kind of lose the person in the process. They win the argument and lose the person, because if you have basically completely sort of trashed your opponent, that's not necessarily going to be the way to actually help them to see that Christianity is something they would want to be true. So very frequently, I've often seen actually, fairly mediocre attempts at trying to persuade people rationally have extraordinarily, well, the results are extraordinary, because even though the arguments maybe weren't that good, it was the actual way that they were put across, that the fact that Christian took that skeptic seriously. They didn't kind of dismiss them or try to kind of shout them down. And there are so many people who I've seen that happen with, where they may not really have ever been convinced by the arguments, but it was actually the character of the person that they were engaging in that conversation with which really won them over. So yeah, it's absolutely essential that the way we say things matters just as much as what we say. My hope is that, yeah, especially with the Unbelievable show, people saw that it wasn't just about those arguments, taking people's objections seriously, being willing to listen, being willing to take the other perspective seriously, putting the best opponents opposite each other, not just kind of creating straw men to knock down. That, I think, is all really important for a skeptic to take you seriously in the first place, and not just see this as pat answers or a kind of script that you're just kind of reeling off, and that person's just another project to be kind of converted. So that's all really, really important.
So you've helped us understand the new atheism phenomenon that really grew in the 2000s. And you mentioned how over the time that you've been, part of this huge discussion around different worldviews and sharing why faith in Jesus makes intellectual sense. You mentioned, though, that the new atheism has run out of steam. So what has changed?
I think there's lots of different things that have happened, but a major thing, I think, is that the new atheism never answered people's ultimate questions about purpose and meaning and identity. they pointed people towards science and reason, and they kind of projected this as the answer, the wonderful savior science that would create this world, this utopia of reasonable people, reaching for the stars. And the reality is that just hasn't materialized. What's actually happened, as we've lost the Christian stories in the West, is that all kinds of other stories have swept in its place. So I think there was a kind of a naive optimism on the part of the new atheists that once we get rid of religion, it'll just be all these reasonable, free-thinking people, following science and reason to their heart's content. But that's not what's happened. And even the new atheists themselves have recognized this. I've seen a lot more interviews where Richard Dawkins and Peter Boghossian, other kind of architects of this movement, have just recognized that what has replaced traditional religion are lots of other quasi-religions. So some of these are right in their own backyard in academia. These are perhaps sort of social justice ideologies, particular gender and sexuality identities that are now kind of treated almost as sacrosanct. They have a kind of almost religious flavor to them in the way that they are advocated for and defended. And this has suddenly sort of woken up, I think, a lot of the new atheists to the fact that you don't ever kind of get rid of the kind of religious impulse in people. It's always going to be there. It's just going to be directed somewhere else. And I think that's what's happened in our culture. And it's not just sort of on the progressive left issues. I think if you look on the political right, you've got political mythologies around certain messiah-like figures in the US who are going to make America great again. All of that stuff is again, it's replacing one story with another story. And those stories were never meant to take the place of God, in my opinion. And so what we get in our culture, I think, is a sort of all of these stories bashing up against each other, creating these culture wars. And I think what a lot of even the new atheists have recognized is that we're no better off. In fact, maybe we were better off with Christianity, because that was a story that for a long time gave people a sense of purpose and meaning and identity and a kind of a common consensus, if you like, about what life is about. Mm. So I think it's been really interesting to see that shift happening in our culture. And what it's meant is that a lot of new atheists have been a lot less confident in their thesis about what will happen once we get rid of religion. Secondly, they've recognized that we are, as I say, kind of inherently religious. You're never going to get rid of that. And C, it's actually made a lot of them take Christianity a lot more seriously because they've suddenly realized, well, atheism didn't cut it. Secular materialism just hasn't delivered on its promises. And it's so interesting to hear so many more secular voices now giving Christianity a second look, because a lot of them are saying, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe there was something useful here in Christianity. After all, the West is kind of built on the whole idea, isn't it? So should we take a second look? And those, as I say, have been the kinds of interesting conversations that are now emerging as new atheism wanes, and these secular intellectuals asking these new questions and having these new conversations kind of start to replace them in many ways.
And the fact that it feels like the general kind of mainstream media are picking up on some of these comments, conversations. I know only recently Richard Dawkins was being interviewed and said he calls himself a cultural Christian. I mean, you'd never imagine that coming out of his mouth 10 years ago when he's standing there and, ridiculing someone for having a belief in God. Yet he sees the virtues of Christianity and what it means for his lifestyle here in the West.
Yeah, I'd agree. And that's just a classic example of the way the tone has changed extraordinarily. So I couldn't help but laugh, though, when I did watch the interview, because it's a very strange thing he's saying. He's saying, essentially, I appreciate all the benefits of the cultural Christianity of the England, UK, where I've grown up. I like the carols at Christmas. I like the nice cathedrals. I like the parish church down the road. And he says, but then at the same time, he says, of course, I don't want anyone to believe this stuff, but I like all the stuff that's come out of that belief. And I'm like, well, you're not going to have any of that stuff, Richard, in the end, if people stop believing in it. And so this is this very contradictory kind of thing going on in our culture. And his view is symptomatic of a lot of people, actually, who say, I really like the benefits of religion. I think Christianity is really useful, but of course it's not true. And that's the problem, is that I think it's the other way around. I think Christianity is only useful and it's only got these benefits because it is true. I think it's the truth of Christianity and the fact people really did believe it that absolutely made them do all the things that we now take for granted, the establishment of human rights, the creation of education and hospitals and welfare, and all the things that a lot of people frankly don't even realize came from the Christian tradition, are there because people really believe this stuff that Jesus of Nazareth said and kind of went out and changed the world because of it. So it's so interesting at this moment to see a lot of, as I say, yeah, secular, even atheists like Richard Dawkins kind of saying, yeah, we like the benefits of Christianity, but then to sort of say, but it's still not true, just for me is kind of, they're sort of soaring off the branch on which they're sitting. They want everything that's given to them, but they also completely undercut it by claiming it's not true.
Do you think that there is, to keep in theme with the title of your podcast and book, but a surprising rebirth of belief in God is the name, but a surprising rebirth of understanding around the benefits of Christianity? I grew up with a Christian mum. Her dad came to know Jesus later in life, but I was taught biblical truths from a young age, but I didn't understand until later, and I don't blame her for this. Like you've already pointed out, a lot of the benefits, a lot of the structural or the foundations of what enables the Western world with its many foibles, but to function in the way that many enjoy is because of the Christian teaching, because of Jesus, human rights, equal rights, universities, hospitals, schools. And it's something that I never realized. And it's like something in my adult life I'm now learning about the benefits of Christianity to the Western world. And I know that in your podcast, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God and book, you chart the journey of some of these, as you've already mentioned, but some actually secular voices, most notably Tom Holland, whose work looking into the history of the world and of the West and what difference that Jesus and the teachings of Christianity has made to our world. I know that you even call him one of the greatest evangelists without even realizing it, because he's not done it so that people come to know Jesus. And himself, he's not a Christian. I know he's open and he's journeying, but do you think there is a rebirth of understanding around the benefits of Christianity to our everyday lives?
Yeah, and I think you've absolutely nailed it there, because I've called the book and the podcast series The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. But I think there's lots of places where people are on the spectrum. There are people who absolutely, I tell a number of the stories in both the book and podcast of people who have crossed the line and have come from a sort of very secular atheism actually to Christian faith. But you've got a lot of these kind of liminal characters, like, as you say, Tom Holland. And I always have to caveat, not the Marvel superhero Spider-Man one, the historian Tom Holland, host
with
of,
with a little known podcast you may have heard.
Yes, exactly. That little known podcast, the rest is history. But also author of a huge book called Dominion, in which he really, to some extent, tells his own story as well as the story of Christianity. And it is a fascinating one. Just very briefly, Tom Holland kind of grew up with a sort of nominal Christian background, but it had fizzled out by his teenage years. But as he started to research and write popular books on the Greco-Roman world, he quickly came to realize how very alien their values were from his own as a sort of liberal Western person. This was a world, the Greco-Roman world, where slavery was just a de facto part of the economy, where the lives of women and children were very cheap, where some people could be sexual property of other people, where Caesar, when he boasts of his triumphs of killing 1 million Gauls, enslaving another million, is parading it through the streets in triumph, the sort of thing we would today call a genocide. And he realized that as much as he found this world really interesting, fascinating, it was also completely alien and quite disturbing in many ways. And he came to the conclusion, and he sort of writes, over more than 600 or 800 pages about these conclusions, that actually all the things he has come to believe as a modern Westerner, as you say, human rights, equality, dignity, compassion, progress, they all come not from the Greeks or the Romans, and they don't come from atheism or science or the Enlightenment. All of these things stand downstream of the Christian Revolution. It was Christianity that birthed all of these things that we now absolutely take for granted in the West. So as he puts it, we are now like goldfish swimming in water. If you ask the goldfish, how's the water today? They'll say, what water? Because they don't realize it's there. And we're the same, he says. We don't realize just how much our fundamental assumptions about human value, life, and everything that, you would find in the average humanist manifesto are actually the result of our Christian heritage. And so he's kind of been a thorn in the sides of a lot of, secular humanists. He's got into a lot of Twitter spats with people on this. But it's fascinating because I think his voice has become extremely influential. just briefly, he is one of the reasons why, for instance, since I wrote the book, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, probably the most famous female atheist in the world, has said she has now embraced Christianity. And she specifically mentions Tom Holland's thesis. She came to realize that secular materialism cannot, A, give her the personal sense of meaning that she was looking for, and it cannot provide a sort of bastion against the many competing worldviews out there, including fundamentalist Islam, which she had escaped, as a young woman herself, and kind of leapt into atheism. But she'd realized in the past 20 years, atheism doesn't work. That's not going to hold out against Putin or China or what she sees as the dangerous forces of sort of progressive ideologies on the left. She realized that the thing that had given her the values and that she espouses is the Christian revolution. And so it's so fascinating to see this conversation happening in real time when someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the last person you would expect, she was there on the platforms with Sam Harris and Dawkins and others saying, I now consider myself a Christian. It's fascinating. And so that's kind of what I've been trying to sort of say is there are these really interesting secular thinkers who are somewhere along this spectrum, but what they've all got in common is that they're all effectively what Ayaan Hirsi Ali called herself. They're lapsed atheists. The atheist account of reality just doesn't make sense anymore. Now, some of them are sort of in that kind of Christianity is a useful fiction kind of mode. Others are teetering on the edge. I think that's where Tom Holland finds himself. And some, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, have said they're in it now. They've embraced it. They're still on a journey. But yeah, it's fascinating to see the way that some of those quite well-known people now are talking in such very different terms about Christianity, its value, and why we believe what we believe, essentially.
It reminds me of one of my earliest memories of thinking about God. I must have been about 9 or 10. And I remember so vividly walking along, holding on to the pram of one of my younger brothers, and chatting to my mum about God. And I remember thinking, if God is real, and I don't believe that God is real, that doesn't change God being real. And I know often we hear in the opposing camp, the whole God of the gaps argument, like you're just trying to fill something, a meaning in your life. I know Richard Dawkins is very well known, and like the other four horsemen speak about you're looking for meaning. So you're putting God into that place. The fact there is no meaning is just the answer. That is the end of the story. But it kind of fits the way around. I think, just because you don't believe and you have this often anger and a strength of conviction on it that can sway people because of the emotion behind it, just because you don't believe doesn't mean that God's not true, and I think it can work both ways on that argument as well, as you've mentioned with Ayaan.
Well, I think there's a sort of, for every God of the gaps argument, there's a sort of atheism of the gaps argument, if you like. It's kind of like, if you say, oh, you just believe because you were raised in, a Christian household or a Christian country or something, that might be, I can turn around to an atheist, and say, well, you don't believe because you were raised in an atheist household. I mean, we can all just sort of point out each other's sort of private motivations and things. The question, is it true? Is there a God? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? I happen to think there are some really good arguments to say that he did, and people who would say that's been borne out in the experience of their lives as well. What's interesting is that, there is just a matter of truth. I mean, this is at least something we can agree on, with the new atheists. So I think I've said a lot of things, that are not very sympathetic about their movement. But one thing that at least I did appreciate was that they were concerned about the truth of things. And I think that's important. I think there has been a turn sometimes in our culture towards a very postmodern, well, look, you can have your truth, I can have my truth, we'll all just agree to disagree. Now, I think it's actually really important that we say it matters whether or not God exists. It matters whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. What's interesting to me is that what's changed, I think, when it comes to the conversation with atheists on this front, is that I bump into more and more people who are less confident in that assumption about reality, that of course miracles don't happen. Of course, nature is just this long, unending, deterministic physical process. A lot more people are now seriously asking questions about that whole worldview. And I do think it's opening people up to the possibility that maybe there's something in this God thing. So I think we're in a quite exciting moment where there's just a new spiritual openness, honestly. among a lot of people who perhaps would have been far more closed to it in the sort of the new atheist era.
And I want to pick up on that just to finish with in a moment, on what it means for those of us who do have faith, for those of us as the church. And as we started the conversation, that often the church conversation is all about the decline rather than, like you say, the excitement around the conversation. The word truth, I think, is so key. That is where my faith came alive in a way that became real emotionally, but intellectually, when I started to actually think about truth and what is truth, which is a conversation we'll go into another time, Justin. But I think that is a great starter for anyone who hasn't actually ever thought about it before. What is truth? I want to pick up as well on, you mentioned obviously Ayaan Hirsi Ali and her conversion and kind of this out of the blue, well, maybe not out of the blue, but the surprise around her conversion from being such a stoic atheist. There's also people who maybe aren't as known for their opposition to Christianity, but certainly known for their very secular lifestyles. I'm thinking of Russell Brand in particular, who has recently publicly declared his faith in Jesus. And I think there can be quite a lot of skepticism from some of us believers when we see well-known people explore faith. I remember when Russell Brand was baptized, and a lot of people on social media, where these conversations often happen, were arguing that he's not a Christian, he's just exploring spiritualism in general, whereas others were saying, well, actually, he's young in his faith and he's in need of discipleship. Why are we giving him such a hard time? Talk to us about the need to, it goes back to the conversation the point we were making earlier about the tone of the debate and what the Bible teaches about it. But just as Christians, being careful, and non-Christians, but careful to be cynical to people and their journey. Because as you've already laid out, as much as we can argue the intellectual reason for God, it's a relationship. We know that as Christians, that it's a relationship we're being offered from Jesus, and each is different. Everyone's got their own journey.
Yeah, and I would like to sort of see a bit more grace sometimes given to people who are maybe at the very beginning of their journey. None of us actually become Christians for entirely pure reasons. I know many of Christian person who now calls themselves a Christian, it was because they fancied that girl in the youth group, so they started going, or whatever, or the CU was giving out free food. There's all kinds of reasons why people kind of end up bumping into Christianity, and likewise, there was similarly a lot of ink spilled around the time Ayaan Hirsi Ali's story came out, and quite rightly people were debating, is this just a sort of cultural, political conversion? She talked about sort of civilizational war and so on, but I think if you actually go a bit below the sort of just the title of the article and then watch some interviews she's done subsequently, you see that actually there's definitely a heart issue going on. She was looking for meaning and purpose, and it's a very moving sort of story she tells of how she'd kind of reached rock bottom at a personal level. She was very depressed. She just couldn't seem to make sense of how to get meaning out of life in her sort of atheist mold. She was, alcoholic. She was in therapy, and her therapist finally challenged her and said, I think you're spiritually bankrupt. And she said, well, I can't believe in God, if that's what you're saying, because the God I grew up with was a monster. And her therapist said, well, what kind of a God could you believe in? And Ayaan Hirsi Ali says, well, I suppose, and she starts to describe the God she might be willing to believe in. And she said, as she did that, she realized she was describing Jesus Christ. And so she says, rather than invent a new God, I thought, well, why not look into this person? And that was the point at which she started going to church. She sort of dived in. And I just think that's a really interesting guy, because it's, there's all kinds of reasons why people start to look into Christianity. And goodness me, if we didn't have a God of grace who can sort through all that, but still bring out the best and redeem us, despite our very fallen reasons for searching and groping for him, then, we'd all be in the same boat. So I likewise, I think, yeah, it's good. We need to extend as much mercy and compassion and grace as we can to someone like Russell Brand. I'm not going to go to Russell Brand for my theology, but I'm very glad that he seems to have had a genuine encounter with Christ, which at this point, I've got no particular reason to doubt his sincerity. Now, obviously, there are still lots of questions surrounding Russell Brand. We know that there are outstanding allegations from several women about him. And his conversion and baptism shouldn't stop at all. The course of justice taking place if things need to be answered and so on. Absolutely. But that is just part of the reality of being a Christian. We can experience transformation, repentance, a new start. what all the while acknowledging that we live in a world where justice needs to be done and so on. It's grace and mercy and truth and justice come together in the person of Jesus Christ, and that doesn't change in life. So I just want, yeah, Christians to extend, I suppose, that same hope, that we've all encountered, that grace that we've all encountered if we call ourselves a Christian, to people who are, yeah, maybe at the beginning of that journey. I think actually doing it in the glare of publicity can be a really difficult thing, and I hope that someone like Russell Brand and Hirsi are kind of have people that they can trust and talk to, and not on, because it's one thing to do it in public. I think though sometimes it is important to kind of process your faith at a very personal level with people you trust and not in the media spotlight in that sense. And so I hope my hope and prayer is that would be the case for them.
Yeah, especially with the soundbite news that we often have now, where you've said something and that sticks with you. Just finally, I'm aware the time is against us, but I do want to finish with a thought around what this means for the church. And I say that with meaning all those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus. When we think about the hope that is surrounding this conversation that you brought us, the Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, the name of your podcast and book, Justin Brierley. But when we think about the church, you said there's a real excitement that's building. You sense it through the conversations you're having. And you've drawn out some points there around, people are seeking, and the unlikeliest of people. We don't know. We can think, oh, they're not, or they don't care. They've not. But it's a reminder, I suppose, of the purpose of church and why we gather, yes, to grow in our faith, but to share and to go, to ask questions, to grapple with some of the difficulties. So what's your message to the church when we're thinking about this new excitement ahead?
Well, I would just go back to, how you opened the interview, and you talked about some of those quite depressing statistics that we're all familiar with, the decline of church going in the West, more and more people saying they're non-religious and everything. And I don't contest any of those statistics, but I don't think that's the end of the story. And I think if you're a Christian, if you believe in God, you've got to believe that God has a bigger plan for the church. And we might just be seeing one particular moment in the West. If you actually look on a global level, the church has never been stronger. It's been growing faster than at any other time in history. In the West, we're kind of going through an interesting phase where a lot of people have decided they don't believe in God. But things come and go. Tides go out and tides come back in again. And that's sort of the central metaphor, really, of my book and podcast, is that we've seen this long, famous poem called Dover Beach, where Matthew Arnold talks about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. And a lot of people have assumed that will just happen forever. The sea will continue to go out in faith forever. But as an interesting person called Douglas Murray, who himself is one of these Tom Holland type characters, he calls himself a Christian atheist. He said to me in an interview once, well, the thing about the sea of faith, Justin, is it could come back in again. That's the point of tides. And I've become convinced, actually, that is what's happening. We are seeing a turning of the tide. And so I think there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. Now, that doesn't mean that we just sit back and say, hey, let's just welcome all these meaning-seeking, ex-atheists into our congregations. There's hard lessons for the church here, because often we can, be answering the questions that people are no longer asking. If we continue to sort of just be responding in the way we did to the new atheists, we might miss the fact that there's a whole new conversation going on. There's a different set of questions people are asking, which are far more around meaning and purpose and give me a reason to get out of bed in the morning, than about the sort of just kind of convince me that God exists type of argument. So I think that's really important for the church to understand what's happening in the culture, but also to be a little bit bolder and a little bit more confident in the fact we have the most compelling story that's ever been told. It's a story that I think all these other people in their other searches and stories are ultimately looking for. And whether or not you feel like the people in your life or around you are open to that story, I've seen enough surprising examples of people who I would never have thought would become a Christian, becoming Christians. And sometimes it's just about waiting for the right moment, waiting to the point at which the story they have been basing their life on kind of finally runs out of steam. And I think we're kind of getting to that point a lot in our culture right now. I think the stories people are telling themselves, they're not working out. They're running out of steam. We're living in the midst of a massive mental health crisis that I think is actually a product of this meaning crisis, because people don't have a story to make sense of their life anymore. And so I think the church stands at a moment of enormous opportunity. Let's pray, though. Let's not assume we can just do this on the strength of our intellect and clever podcasts and books. It is a move of the Spirit in the end. But I'm very encouraged, because one of the things that people told me when I released the book sort of last summer, they saw the title, and a lot of skeptics on Twitter and elsewhere said, "What are you talking about? A surprising rebirth of belief in God, Justin? All of the statistics are pointing in the other direction." And I couldn't exactly argue with them. All I had really was quite a bit of anecdotal stories about, these changing conversations and things. But I've actually bumped into more and more surprising statistics just in the last few months about changes, the amount of young people now who are far more open to God and spirituality than an older generation, and also surprising examples of sudden upturns in church growth, the flattening out of those who say they're nuns, and also just lots and lots of people telling me that I've been seeing loads of interesting people walking into church recently. I had a conversation with P. Gregg recently, who sort of has been collating different examples where he's seeing something really interesting happening in the culture. Unprecedented numbers in many churches at Easter. Lots of stories of surprising rebirth. You've got all these, well-known celebrity people suddenly, showing an interest. Something's happening. And I don't claim to have, the magic answer or the overview or anything, but it just feels like, yeah, something's definitely happening. And that should give us some encouragement that actually God's on the move. God's not finished with the church. And let's face it, God's always been in the business of bringing dead things back to life. So that's my prayer. That's my hope for the church. Be encouraged. As much as we often feel like, oh, it's all going to hell in a handbasket, God has a way of surprising us. And that's what I hope this podcast and book will help people to see.
Amen. I love that God is not surprised by what is happening, even though we often are. And also just a thought, you've already brought it out, explaining the heart behind apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith, but it comes from that beautiful scripture in 1 Peter 3 that says, always be ready to give the reason for the hope you have. It doesn't say always be ready to give the answer to the question you're asked. And I think for me, when I realized I don't need to have the answers, actually asking questions is more helpful. Just look what Jesus did. But just thinking about, why do I have hope in Jesus if I do? And am I able to explain that to someone if they were to ask me? I think that's really all that God is asking.
That's a beautiful way of expressing it, Helen. And I just think that's right. It's about just being open to being there for the conversation. You won't always have all the right answers. None of us do. But thank goodness it's not dependent on us. And it's about what God is doing. And we just have to be ready to hopefully be there with, yes, as good an answer, best an answer as we can. But ultimately, yeah, it's the reason is what people are seeing is in front of them. It's your life actually that's going to speak louder than words. So yeah, go for it.
Well, we're very grateful that you have been there and that you've been asking questions and hosting these fascinating conversations, and now really sharing so much of the knowledge and experience and wisdom that you've drawn out over the years. I really want to recommend the podcast series. It's called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. The book with the same title as well. Do check it out. But Justin Brierley, thank you so much for joining us on the Life Issues podcast.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on.